Hello, my name is Andrew Peel, and welcome to development update number 2, titled Extending Blender's Data Structure. So in the first development update, we discussed how we were able to use the Python API to extend Blender's user interface. But I really only showed how the interface was laid out and the workflow with the drag and drop features. So we had several requests of people wanting to kind of take a look under the hood to see how the code was written and structured. So in this video, we're going to be doing just that. Now, some areas might get a little technical, but I'm going to attempt to explain this so even non-developers will kind of have an understanding of how this works. And if this is something that interests you and you want to find out more information, then I would recommend checking out blendercookie.com. Jonathan Williamson and Patrick Bullions have some great scripting tutorials on creating custom panels and menus. And one of them is even an entire code review of a Blender add-on that Patrick Bullions created, so you can kind of get an idea of everything that's required to create an add-on from scratch. I think that one requires a citizen membership, but for all of the training information that you get, the citizen membership is well worth it. And I'm not sponsored by them at all, but I just think that they create great content, so if you're not already a citizen membership, it's definitely worth checking out. There's also some great information on the Blender Wiki. They have some good written documentation on how to create some add-ons, so definitely check that out. But Fluid Designer wasn't developed as just a standard add-on. Now, all those same concepts apply, but there's a little bit more to it. And to understand this a little bit better, let's take a look at what's installed with Blender. Okay, so we can see here that I have Blender 2.69 downloaded, and this is just the zip file for Windows 64-bit, so I've extracted this to my desktop, and in the root folder here, we can see that we have the Blender exe, which is obviously used to launch the application, along with some DLL files and things that we don't really need to get into. If we go into this 2.69 directory, and then into the scripts directory, this is pretty much where all of the magic happens, I guess you can say. And so here in the add-ons directory, we have all of the add-ons that are shipped with Blender by default. And in the modules, there's some additional modules that we'll talk about later on. And here in the startup directory, here's where Blender defines some of their operators. Most of them are built in the compiled C code, but there are some defined here as well. And then obviously the Blender UI. So these are all the scripts that make up Blender's user interface. And so that's just how Blender looks by default, but let's go ahead and take a look at how Fluid Designer looks. Okay, so if we open up the Fluid Designer directory, we can see it's pretty similar. The icon's different just so we can differentiate between the two versions here. But if we go into the 2.69 directory and then into the scripts folder, we don't actually add any scripts to the add-ons directory. This is just pretty much how it is shipped with Blender. We do include most of the functionality in the modules directory. It's actually just two Python scripts. We have the Fluid Designer data blocks and the Fluid Designer utilities. And so this is the file that actually extends all of Blender's existing data, and we'll go over that here in just a minute. But if we go back here and go into the startup directory, we can also see that we still included the BL operators and user interface, but we've also included Fluid operators and the Fluid UI. And so we didn't want to remove any functionality that Blender implements, but we can just basically switch between these two directories. We also have a Fluid main, which just kind of handles some of the application startup events and things like that, which we can go into later on. But now that we've kind of seen how it's all laid out on disk, let's go ahead and open up Eclipse and see how the code actually is structured. So we can see here in the Explorer, if we open up the Fluid Designer scripts here, we can see we have the scripts directory already imported into Eclipse, and this is the same directory that we were taking a look at on disk. And so if we open up the modules folder here, we can open up the Fluid Designer data blocks, and these are all the data block extensions. And so here, let's go and take a look at this in the outline. So if we collapse all these, let's go ahead and take a look at the Fluid Designer object. So this is the class that we're using to extend the object type in Blender. And so here's all of the additional properties that we're adding to the object. Along with here, if I expand this, we can see we're also extending some functions to this object class as well. And the way that this works is that we just have a standard Python class. We're inheriting the property group, which is just a standard Blender type, which again, we're importing up here at the top. And then at the very end of each of these classes, if I go down here, we can see that we're registering the class using the BPY utils module and passing in the class to register. But that's still not enough to let Blender know. We still need to tell Blender which type that we want to extend. And so here at the very bottom of this class, we have extend Blender's data. And there's really no reason to put it in a class, I just did for whatever reason. So we can see here we have that FD object class. And here this is the magic line that basically extends Blender's functionality. And so we say BPY types and then the type that we want to extend. And then here I'm just giving it a namespace of MV, just so I'm storing all of my extensions in a namespace. That way if we update Blender, we will most likely not have any namespace collisions or anything like that. So that is how all of that works. And you can see that we are extending materials, objects, groups, scenes, worlds, and we're even creating new ones. And so here if we take a look at this list, we have one that's really important, which is the data manager. And so Blender implements a window manager which kind of has some control over most of the UI elements, but the data manager inside Fluid Designer has control over all of the data. And so we can see here we have a pointer property to a class that is basically holds all of the libraries that are currently loaded in Fluid Designer, which again its just type is the FD pointer library collection, which is right here. But the data manager is responsible for quite a bit more than just holding all of the libraries. And if we open up its definition here in the outliner, we can see that it's got its obviously standard properties, but there's a lot of functions included in the data manager. So it knows how to retrieve information out of the libraries. It knows how to add groups and objects and things in kind of a logical way to the scene. It knows how to set the names of objects and groups. Naming is very important within Blender just because they kind of use the name as the way of retrieving data out of the blend file, and maybe we'll go into that a little bit later on. But it also has some ability to kind of get objects and groups and things like that that are currently in the scene, as well as some other things that are very important. So just know that the data manager class is very important, but we'll see down here at the bottom that we're not really extending that to any of these classes, and that's because the data manager is contained within the scene. And so if we go to the Fluid Designer scene here, we can see here that we have the DM, which again is the data manager, not the dungeon master, but we can see here this is where we're actually extending the scene class with the data manager. So each scene has its own way of managing the data within it. And also has a UI namespace, which is just a pointer property to some additional interface elements. So just to get an idea of how this works, so here we have the pointer property to the class FD interface, which we can see is just defined right above it. And this class holds some information like use default Blender interface. And so this is just a Boolean property that basically allows the user to either display the Blender interface or not. And so just to kind of get an example of how this actually works, if we go into the startup directory and we can take a look, let's collapse these here, we'll take a look at the Blender UI, and let's go ahead and go to the Space View 3D. Okay, so this is the script that defines all of the default UI information for Blender for the 3D viewport. And so we can see here in this first class that defines the header. We can see here we're just creating a variable that stores the UI elements for Fluid Designer. We're getting access to that by accessing the current scene, going into that namespace, and then just accessing that variable. And so that will give us access to all of the properties in that class. And so then we're just accessing a property in there by saying if the use default Blender interface is turned on, then we're going to be obviously displaying all of the default UI information, otherwise we won't. So it's a pretty simple concept, but it is very powerful to be able to extend Blender's data this way. So that's a pretty simplified explanation of how we extended Blender's data structure. But if this is something that interests you, then you can download the entire scripts directory from GitHub, and I'll post a link in the description. You can kind of review this and see a little bit more details of how all of this is built. And if you have any questions, then just tweet at me or leave me a comment on this video. And also let me know if you found this helpful. I would imagine that most people would find these types of videos probably pretty boring, but then again, I just don't know. So the next video that I'm going to make is going to be back into some more visually interesting stuff. I'm going to demo the data manager, and so that's a really important part of Fluid Designer. But for now, I appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you guys next time.